știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Țări pe drum știut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. E pentru că pe lume partidul s-a dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce-nseamnă ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. самых окраин, южных гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, отдых и на труд. Весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем заклад.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. It is the evening of the 15th of July, 2025, and here we are with a live stream focusing on, well, part two of our what will be an ongoing series, which is What Does a Revolution Look Like? And you can find part one back from a few days ago, and that was originally going to be just one episode, but given that there is so much to say on this subject, it is, of course, advisable to make sure that we have as comprehensive a coverage of this subject as possible. So before we get underway, I'll just tell everybody in the form of housekeeping, be sure to like and share the stream if you have not done so already. Also, in the future, and you may have noticed this already coming with the recent video, which was a clip from our last Q&A, there's going to be more clips coming out as I go through the back catalog and clip out like 10 to 20 minute segments to post up on the YouTube page, simply because there's a lot of things that get said in these streams that sometimes will be very good as segments on their own. So if you do happen to see a 5 to 20 minutes, shall we say, segment that you think is good and you would think would be good as a clip in and of itself, then do let me know. But I'll be putting out more clips as a matter of course in the near future. It makes the content a little more digestible. So we'll get underway, and I'm aware that there are questions in the chat. And thanks to Slumbering Colossus, who says sharp-dressed man. You could be referring to me. You could be making a reference to the ZZ Top song, but the ZZ Top song is indeed, of course, a classic, and I will not hear any arguments about that whatsoever. Always go with a band who have beards, and the guy who doesn't have a beard, his name is Beard. Look it up; it's true. Right? Okay. So ZZ Top references aside, maybe we'll do a song request show at some point. We will dive into the episode. So the first episode, we focused upon things like the Paris Commune, the Russian Revolution of 1905, and we got into the building up of the revolution in 1917 and what all of this looked like. Now, today, I'm going to focus on the 1917 revolution with specific reference to the changes that took place between February and October 1917, or March to November 1917, depending on which style of calendar one is looking at. And by the way, if you're wondering what the flag behind me is, I'll just point the camera up to it so you can see. There you go. That's the flag of the known as the Starry Plough. That's the Irish Republican flag used by, amongst others, James Connolly and the Citizen Army of 1916, another revolution that we will get into in due course in some discussion with Irish comrades, perhaps. But back to the transition from February to October 1917 and the whole question of like how the Bolsheviks triumphed. See, the situation in February 1917 is that the Russian proletariat is actually the most revolutionary proletariat in arguably the world. Now, there's certain arguments to be had about who was in the lead if we're doing leaderboards during that time. But it is my contention and the contention of many who have observed this, that the Russian proletariat in its course of development from the 1870s through to the early part of the 20th century went through, in a concentrated period of time, an awful lot of very rapid industrial development and also very rapid industrial and industrial political development. And you see that through the vast strike waves of the 1890s and into the early 1900s, the experience of the 1905 to 1907 revolution, which was, of course, a 2-year-long process, which included the dual power situation existing in Petrograd and Moscow for a time, a period of guerrilla warfare in the countryside, a long period of battling the repression of the Tsarist state, the giving of concessions or a minimal amount of concessions to the bourgeois by the Tsarist state, and the Russian bourgeois being very easily bought off by that. But that gave the Russian proletariat, or should we say the proletariat of the wider Russian Empire, an awful lot of real battle experience that many of the others just did not have. Many of the other working classes of the more industrialized countries didn't have that. And certainly they didn't have that in a concentrated period of time, nor did they have the rapid growth of a revolutionary party in a concentrated period of time. Going from the early translations of Marx and Engels' work into Russian by Plekhanov, Zasulich, and others in the 1880s, through to the development of Lenin's theory of revolution and the organization of the Revolutionary Party in 1903, through to the testing of these theories in practice in 1905. This all happens in a relatively short amount of time, which is partially to do with the fact that the Russian bourgeois comes on the scene relatively late and is trying to catch up. But also you have large amounts of capital being poured into Tsarist Russia from France, Britain, and Germany. Later you get some from the US, but it's mainly France and Britain, Germany being close behind them. And this develops not only a very militant proletariat, but the most advanced revolutionary party in the world in the form of the Bolsheviks. But we must also acknowledge that even with this very militant proletariat, which had already come towards revolutionary conclusions in 1905, it still needed the proper relationship between them and the vanguard party to actually succeed at making a revolution. And this comes about thanks to, well, the militancy of the Russian working class itself, but also the role played by Lenin himself and the role played by the Bolshevik Party once it had been transformed by Lenin's analysis and understanding of the situation, which develops all the way through 1905, immediately afterwards. And then Lenin continues to develop his perspective under the pressure of the imperialist war, World War I, under the pressure of being in exile, but also the need to constantly reassess the situation and retool the Bolshevik Party for when the time comes. And this is indeed what Lenin does. So we'll turn to Lenin's genius first. I mean, Lenin was a genius when it comes to many different areas, but I would argue that his most outstanding quality was his political, tactical, and strategic ability, because not only was he able to understand the essence of the struggle in terms of the different levels of consciousness that the working class would need to go through, but also how the relationship with the peasantry should be constructed, how the working class could win over the peasantry into a solid alliance, how the working class could make the revolution, and how to create and reinforce proletarian ideology against opportunism and economism. Because this is, of course, one of Lenin's biggest battles was the consistent battle against economism. Economism as defined by Edward Bernstein and others, which is to do with the idea that there could be a slow march through the institutions to get to socialism, that there wouldn't be the need for revolution or revolutionary violence. That the situation had outgrown that, and that what was needed was this peaceful economic development combined with political or bourgeois democracy, and that this would, due to the proletariat's sheer weight of numbers, bring us towards socialism. That point of view, as expressed by Bernstein, has repeated in every generation since then. In every generation, there are more Bernsteins. Particularly in the imperialist countries, but elsewhere as well. But in the imperialist countries, it's particularly pernicious. And you get more Bernsteins later on in life, later on in the 20th century, having the Bernstein's point of view ultimately triumphs in the Second International, despite the fact that he was formally defeated. The Bernsteinian economistic point of view also comes back into the Third International itself and comes to dominate the point of view of not only the Western European communist parties, but due to the Khrushchevite revisionism, comes to dominate the CPSU itself, the successor to the Bolshevik Party. And the economistic point of view is the point of view that ultimately was one that was embraced by the Mensheviks. And the tragic thing is that it's ultimately something which triumphs within the Bolshevik Party when it changed its name to the CPSU. With what comes back with Khrushchev is the Menshevik point of view, the idea of peaceful development of economic relations, the idea of peaceful development of the means of production, the idea of there is no need for violent class struggle anymore. That there will be a slow reform process going on. This was the point of view, by the way, of the Communist Party of Great Britain, the Communist Party of France, the Communist Party of Italy from the early 1950s onwards. They all became economistic organizations and all became really, when it came down to it, opposed to militant class struggle. And if the vanguard party is to be anything, it is not only the party that will lead the working class in the revolution, but it has to be, in the period before the revolution, it has to be the party that is the most militant end of the working class, that seeks to provide leadership to the working class based on the mobilization of and the political education of and the organization inside it of the most militant sections of the working class, to be trained and organized in a disciplined fashion. And that is what should be one of the defining features of a revolutionary party, and that was what was forgotten after the early 1950s. As this is a point I've made many times, but it's a point I'm going to keep reiterating. Now, to go back to what distinguishes Lenin in 1917 is that he realizes at certain points that the party's program and the party's approach needs to fundamentally change. So when Lenin returns to Russia in April of 1917, he issues the April thesis, which we've talked about on the program before. What that does is, again, changes the party's program by providing greater clarity. And Lenin provides greater clarity by advancing the slogan, "All power to the Soviets." The whole question there is of why that was necessary. And that was necessary because Lenin recognized that the bourgeois government that emerged after the February Revolution of 1917, that bourgeois government was not only fundamentally very unstable and was going to lead ultimately to the triumph of the most vicious form of reaction, but also it was one that was in thrall to imperialist interests, particularly the British and the French, and also that the Russian bourgeoisie was horrendously weak and wouldn't be even able to do the things that the Mensheviks said that was the duties of the bourgeois revolution. The Russian bourgeois was just too weedy to do them. The industrial development of Russia had become about in large part because the imperialists were using it as a place of as a place that could be used for industrial production and take advantage of cheap Russian labor. And if the bourgeois government was allowed to remain in power, it would not only keep slaughtering Russian peasant soldiers and proletarian soldiers in the war, but it would fundamentally render Russia into something that was a mere vassal state, a neo-colony almost of Britain and France. And so these are the reasons why Lenin comes back and realizes that there is an opportunity here to actually make a socialist revolution, because, like I said, you have the most militant working class in the world in the Russian Empire in 1917. You also have an increasingly radicalized peasantry. And the peasantry, though it lags, its consciousness is not moving as quickly as the proletariats. It is slowly reaching the realization that a further revolution is a necessity. Now, in the working class areas, in Petrograd and Moscow and others, the whole question of the revolution was, of course, made more urgent by the fact that these were the centers of the most hardcore, most militant, most politically developed sections of the proletariat. In the countryside, it was different. In the countryside, you had the peasant Soviets that did emerge were rather weak. The social revolutionaries, the populist successors to the Narodniks, were the dominant political force, and they were a force that combined the middle and even some of the upper peasants. And this force was the dominant force in the countryside until right before the October Revolution, and even retained a significant influence amongst the peasantry until sometime afterwards. But what happens is, due to the escalating and dire situation on the front line, the situation in the countryside starts to get radicalized by some peasant soldiers who come back from the front with the tales of absolute horror, and the positive effect of the Bolsheviks' agitation amongst the Tsarist army starts to pay off, because there'd been a decision made that Bolshevik agitators were to join the Tsarist army and wait and agitate amongst the rank and file peasants and be ready for the time when a revolt broke out, which it did. And the revolt breaks out because of the Tsarist army being so poorly led, so poorly organized, so poorly equipped. I mean, even like anti-Bolshevik histories recount the fact that at certain points in the war, there was the ratio of rifles to men was as low as 1 in 7. And that soldiers were waiting for the man in front of them to die so they could take his rifle and take his boots. So this is an incredibly poorly equipped army. By the way, there is a real effort now amongst Russian official historians, i.e. historians that are employed by the Russian state or are adjacent to the Russian state, to try and square the later reign of Nicholas II with the Stalin period in the early Soviet history. And this, of course, is the latest attempt by the Kremlin to try and desperately square the circle of the reviving of the reputation of Stalin, and more Russians embracing the memory and the legacy of Stalin, with the desperate defense that the Russian bourgeois wants to conduct of the late period Romanov dynasty. And so they try and argue that they weren't losing World War I at all, basing this on the fact that they won several victories over Austria-Hungary, that they didn't lose to the Germans, even though they were, and that the army wasn't ill-equipped, even though it was, and that the outbreak of a revolt at the front was solely down to external agitators. This attempt to square this circle is rather hilarious, but it shows you just how strange an alignment of forces there is in Russia at the moment between these national bourgeois elements and the proletarian elements in Russia, who are more and more embracing the legacy of Stalin. Now, to go back to the point about what's happening in 1917, the Bolshevik agitation amongst the troops at the front line, it translates back to increasing radicalization of the lower peasants in the rear. In the rear, what you have is that you have the peasants return home, and they start agitating amongst their relatives, amongst their fellow villagers where they come from, and start telling the truth about the war, telling the truth about the need for the kind of land redistribution that isn't just the breaking up of the great aristocratic estates amongst those who would later become known as the kulaks, but also for a more radical land reform that goes much further than the SRs are prepared to do. So this is why Lenin puts forward the 3 words of peace, bread, and land. Peace, because the Russian proletariat and peasantry are being slaughtered at the front by the German army. Bread, because the agricultural system has disintegrated and broke down, which is why you get the bread riots of the women workers of February of 1917. And land, to address the question of the ownership of the land, and that it shouldn't just be given to the upper and middle peasants, that it should be distributed down to the lower on those peasants with little or no land at all. And this was something that had been talked about in the circles of the social revolutionaries, but which had been discarded due to their alliance with the Russian bourgeois. So the agitation of the peasant soldiers as they come home really has an impact upon the radicalization of the peasantry. Now, Lenin realizes that the advanced workers are ready to hear the slogan of "all power to the Soviets," and that this is the path to revolution in Russia, ruled by the bourgeois government at the time, because the bourgeois government cannot satisfy any of the demands of the working class or the peasantry. So the working class goes through several different stages of militancy and radicalization throughout 1917. And what you see is that the Bolsheviks, who were initially in very much the minority position in the Soviets, start to catch up to the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries. And it was the Mensheviks that were in the lead role in the urban Soviets in the early part of the revolution, in early to mid 1917. And things start to turn around really after the summer, after Kerensky commits himself or recommits Russia to the war, where there's a disastrous offensive organized by him, which is literally called the Kerensky Offensive. And he is revealed to be really the tool of Britain and France. And he's revealed to be, just as the Tsar did, just as the Russian bourgeois wanted to, use the vast Russian masses in the army as essentially bullet stoppers, and to tie down the German army in the east so that they can't turn their army around and go west and send the hundreds of thousands of Germans back to fight the French and the British and the Americans by that stage. So what is going on is increasing levels of radicalization as the Bolsheviks sink deeper roots into the most advanced sections of the working class. Now, why are they able to sink those roots into the most advanced sections of the working class? They are able to do so precisely because they have the right theory, basing themselves on Lenin's work in what is to be done and one step forward, two steps back, because they have the right internal party regime, which is based on Lenin's theoretical work, because they have a relatively stable revolutionary leadership, as Lenin says there must be, but also because they have constantly worked to recruit militant worker Bolsheviks into their ranks. And because they recruited these solid worker cadres into their ranks as time went on, they were able to gain a solid foothold in the advanced layers of the working class in Petrograd and Moscow in particular. So the various accounts of the Russian Revolution talk about the most advanced sections of the Petrograd working class, including, I think it was the Putilov works, where you found a lot of Bolshevik agitators, and you found that the most militant workers, as 1917 wore on, started to come more and more towards the Bolshevik side, as the words and the program of the Mensheviks started to look more and more hollow. So that you have this coming together of a rising militancy. I mean, there were many workers who were ready to go and try and overthrow Kerensky by July of 1917. But the Bolsheviks actually argued against that, arguing that they didn't have the necessary amount of support amongst the wider working class and peasantry, and therefore going to seize power in July of 1917 would be too early, to be premature. That actually lost them a degree of support amongst the most far out and militant workers who sided with anarchists in calling for the overthrow of the state right then. So it's not just a matter of being the most radical. It's a matter of knowing when you have the correct alignment of forces to actually strike. And Lenin knew that they had to at least win over the major urban centers and have a solid foothold in the peasantry if they were going to carry off what Lenin referred to as the art of insurrection. So by the time we get to September, you're starting to see the Bolsheviks win majorities in the Petrograd and the Moscow Soviets. And given that the Bolshevik slogan is all power to the Soviets, and that the dual power situation cannot continue, so you have, by that stage, you have a militant working class which is turning more and more towards the Bolsheviks. And it should also be emphasized that those who made up the personnel in the Soviets, this was not a fixed thing. You got a lot of workers, soldiers, sailors going through, like the Petrograd and the Moscow Soviets, going through there for a time, for a term when they were elected by their workplace or their regiment or their ship to go and represent them there, but that they would rapidly be replaced by somebody else. So what that means is you're getting more and more workers, soldiers, and sailors exposed to the most radical revolutionary ideas as they are part of the various Soviets of workers, soldiers, and sailors deputies in the urban centers. So you're having this vast radicalization of the entire working class going on at the same time as the Bolsheviks are becoming more and more influential, and the ideas of the Bolsheviks take hold upon the masses. So theory becomes a material force when it grips the masses, to quote Lenin. And this is what was happening. The Bolshevik theory was gripping the masses because the masses had been radicalized and made more militant by the events facing them, which were that the war wasn't ending. The promises of the provisional government were turning out to be ashes in the mouth. The situation they were facing both on the front line and in the workplaces was desperate and dire. The provisional government couldn't solve the food crisis or the wider agricultural crisis. And so when the Bolsheviks said that the provisional government and by extension the bourgeois themselves are the problem, and that they and their state needs to be got rid of, when Lenin said that the bourgeois state must be smashed, then this not only resonates, but it encourages more and more workers to join with the Bolsheviks. So by the time we get to that period before the October Revolution, you have a movement and you have a party, you have a class that has become more and more revolutionary, and a party which has fed into that process and also been strengthened and further radicalized by that process. And see, what Lenin's doing throughout 1917 is that he is continually refining the party's position based upon his analysis of where the proletariat is. And this enables him to win arguments in the Bolshevik Central Committee that initially didn't look like he had a chance of winning. So initially, the Bolshevik Central Committee was ambivalent, or even some of them were opposed to the idea expressed in the April thesis of saying all power to the Soviets. Lenin had to basically start making his argument outside in the open, and when he gets to the train station, when he comes back from Switzerland, he starts addressing the crowds of workers and starts agitating for a position which at the time the Bolshevik Central Committee did not hold and was not party policy. But Lenin, due to the fact that he did have a certain degree of authority with the most militant workers, and he was able to bring the Bolshevik Central Committee over to his point of view. Same with the idea for an insurrection. What happens is the most radical tendencies channeled by Lenin in the working class radicalized the Bolshevik party and were in turn further revolutionized by it. See, the working class is becoming more and more militant as time goes on in 1917. So the effect of that further radicalizes things within the Bolshevik party, and it builds support for Lenin's more revolutionary position. But at the same time, then Lenin wins the various battles inside the Bolsheviks and takes the position of the reconsidered and new positions of the Bolshevik Central Committee and sends those positions back to be tested amongst the masses as 1917 goes on. It's a case of the mass of the workers becoming more radical, going towards revolution, and the case of the Bolshevik leadership becoming advancing a more revolutionary platform as time goes on. See, these two elements, the mass of the workers and the vanguard party, are, as they should, continually interacting and feeding off each other. And so the radical mood of the masses is captured by the Bolshevik leadership and turned into a revolutionary program, which is then taken back to the masses and tested. And the proof of the rightness of that position is in the successful winning of majorities by the Bolsheviks in the Moscow and Petrograd Soviets, and in many other places as well. But those are the two centers of the revolution at that time, and also the increasing success they get with the peasantry, because when February breaks out, the February Revolution breaks out, the peasantry are not anywhere near the Bolshevik position. By the time you get to the later period, just before October, the Bolsheviks at least have a foothold and are starting to win over the lower peasants. And this is why they survive, why the October Revolution succeeds, is because they've not only won over the advanced, most militant sections of the working class, but they've started to break the hold that the social revolutionaries did have over the peasantry by promising a more radical version of land reform than the SRs were prepared to do, or the Mensheviks were prepared to do. But to overcome the historic strength of both the Mensheviks and the SRs essentially takes most of that year. But it does happen by the end, because it's a combination of, as I say, the events on the ground like further anger and radicalize the working class and the peasantry. The Bolsheviks, under the leadership of Lenin, advance a program and advance slogans which tap into the anger of the working class. The anger of the working class it causes it to embrace those slogans, causes it to embrace the Bolshevik Party, which causes the Bolshevik Party itself to become more revolutionary as the year goes on, and Lenin continually recalculates what is possible. But even with that, even with the winning over of the Moscow and Petrograd Soviets to the position of all power to the Soviets, it still took an enormous battle inside the Bolshevik Party's Central Committee to win over that Central Committee to the idea of having the insurrection, of actually going for the insurrection. That was a huge fight that was had there. And it's one that Lenin is able to win, partially because he does have this immense authority, but because by late September of 1917, it is clear that the advanced workers are already wanting to rise up and rid themselves of the provisional government. They're already there, and more of the mass of workers is coming behind them. So Lenin is able to face down Zinoviev and Kamenev and others who were opposed and afraid of an insurrection. This, by the way, partially explains why Lenin allowed or was for a time happy with Trotsky and some of his followers to enter into the ranks of the Bolsheviks, because Trotsky by later 1917 is actually taking a more revolutionary line. And as you know, if you've studied the works of Trotsky veers wildly between like ultra left and ultra right positions. But in the period of the leading up to the October Revolution, Trotsky aligns with Lenin's position for a while. And because Trotsky, let's give the man his due, was a very capable orator and was a very capable agitator, a man capable of doing great feats of propaganda. And to a degree, when it comes to like a sort of military organization, he was capable of pulling off a good degree of military organization. So he did play a certain role in the early Red Army. That's something which has to be acknowledged. So this is why that he is welcomed into the Bolshevik Party, because at that time, Trotsky was taking this revolutionary line that aligned with Lenin, having been in dispute with him for over a decade beforehand and having denounced Lenin over and over again. Lenin realized that Trotsky could be put to good use for a while. And this is the thing about Lenin's strategic genius and tactical genius was that he realized when he needed to bring in even a character like Trotsky, who had shown himself to be unreliable, who had shown himself to be an enemy of Lenin over and over again. But when he aligned and could be put to a decent usage, Lenin went ahead and welcomed him into the party and gave him a role on the Military Revolutionary Committee. And for a while, Trotsky fought alongside and with the Bolsheviks towards similar ends. Now, he continued to show his wildly opportunistic and ultra-leftists and melodramatic orientation when he was given some things to do, such as the later negotiations over the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty. But for a while, he was of use to the revolution, and this is why he got the position that he did. So, but Lenin realized that in this, when you are in the revolutionary moment, that the party has to be incredibly adaptable, and you have to be able to make the temporary alliances, even with figures who are unreliable, even with figures who have been enemies in the revolutionary movement beforehand. And if they can be made use of for a specific period of time, then you make use of them, and in the hope that they learn discipline, in the hope that they are prepared to rectify their errors. Now, as it turns out, Trotsky fell back into his old habits very quickly, but for a while he was of service to the revolution. So to go back to the point about October, it brings together all of these things, brings together a quarter of a century or more of Russian working class development, in terms of it becoming the most militant and revolutionary working class in the world. It brings together the increasing militancy of the proletariat throughout 1917, the increasing radicalization amongst the largely peasant base of the army, the increasing radicalization of the peasants themselves under the influence of peasant soldiers returning home, the winning of control over the major urban centers through the gaining of majorities in the Soviets, and the way in which the working class, the advanced bit of the working class, and the vanguard party all continually interacted with each other to build a revolutionary wave that by October of 1917 could successfully sweep aside the bourgeois forces in the provisional government and sweep aside Kerensky himself. Because by the time the October uprising came, there was very little authority left in the provisional government. What was going to be the case was that it was going to be either a case of that you would get some form of fascist rule in Russia under a general like Kornilov or Wrangel, or some of the other characters that floated around in the revolution, like Kolchak, and it would be a fascist regime that would be in service of the British and the French predominantly, or you were going to get a revolution. So this middle way that you get, like some revisionists or some social democrats talking about, that didn't exist. It was going to be a case of socialism or barbarism. The Russian Empire becomes the Soviet Union and achieves greater feats than any previous Russian state organization could ever have been capable of, or it falls into fascism and is enslaved by the imperialists. Those were the choices. There weren't any others, not any viable ones anyway. And so this October is the perfect coming together of all of these elements. And Lenin realizes at each stage what the working class is ready to hear, even if initially you're only talking to the advanced part of the working class. But because the Russian working class as a whole was the strongest, most revolutionary working class in all of Europe, then it enabled Lenin to keep pushing further in a revolutionary direction, knowing that first the advanced workers, then the wider working class would embrace this. And indeed they did. And so by the time you get to October, the working class is ready to dispose of the provisional government and to actually fight against the reactionary forces that attempted to invade and destroy the early socialist or Soviet republic, and to win that war. And that this is what happens. And so in terms of our question tonight, which is what does a revolution look like in the Russian case in 1917, it is a textbook example of a revolutionary working class, which is objectively speaking taking revolutionary action on its own, even without the vanguard party. But what the vanguard party is needed for is to give that revolutionary energy a clear and concrete direction. See, if the February Revolution created a crisis for the Tsardom which it couldn't resolve, and it opened the door to various bourgeois forces to overthrow the Tsarist state. But this is the question to address, which is that the militant working class had successfully created the conditions for the bourgeoisie to exploit and to bring themselves to power. But the militant working class quickly realizes that their interests are not going to be served by the Russian bourgeois being in power. So this is where, and what they need is the vanguard party to give them the concrete program of action and how to achieve it. And that needs to be something, and Lenin does this. Lenin continually tests positions and slogans with the working class, and he's able to see and correctly perceive at each stage what the most radical parts of the working class are ready to hear and what is ready to be embraced when the Bolshevik party puts it forward. And so because you have this extreme situation in Russia in 1917 where the working class keeps becoming more revolutionary, and as they grow, the Bolshevik party grows with them. As the radicalization gets more revolutionary, as the class becomes more revolutionary, so grows the party itself, because the party had a solid foundation within the working class of solid cadres who could agitate amongst the working class and to bring them towards the revolutionary positions of the Bolshevik party. And that process completes one phase by the overthrow of Kerensky and the destruction of the bourgeois government. And then another phase is going through when the Bolsheviks dispose of the Constituent Assembly because it's been basically outstripped by events. And the working class and the peasantry largely just shrug and get on with defending the revolution. And so, because it was not the proletariat and the peasantry who were really invested in the Constituent Assembly, it was the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie. Right. So what I'll do is now just go to the questions that have come in tonight. So I will handle some of those. And what we're going to be doing is, this is going to be a weekly show. So next week we're going to go on to developments of the early Soviet Union, and then start to look at the Chinese Revolution as well. So hello to those in the comments tonight. So we've got Mystery Man. We have Working Prole Incorporated, Slumbering Colossus, Caustic Grip, A Name. We also have President Jesus. Slumbering Colossus, I posted the song titles from the intro in the Telegram group, which you can access by clicking on the link in the chat. So we have Jenny, our moderator. Good afternoon to you. We have Rob the Slav over on Rumble. And by the way, if you haven't shared the stream, be sure to do so. And to be sure to subscribe to the relevant channel, either YouTube, Rumble, Kick, etc. We're on all of those tonight. And hello to Dingo Ate Me Baby. Hello to Sid Hatfield. And hello to David Ball and Enigma and Nikki Const and Ogas Cybernetics, and to Comrade Jerry, and to YepX, who says, I have a question. What is the difference between being a communist versus a Marxist-Leninist? Also, these days, some socialists come across as liberals to me. Well, that's because they are. I mean, the difference between being a communist and Marxist-Leninist, I mean, if we're going to be strictly accurate, we should say that, like, a Marxist-Leninist is what a communist should be, but it's not always what a communist is. There are many different types of communism, of course. There always have been. And this is, of course, something which Marx and Engels themselves talk about in the Communist Manifesto. And so there's all kinds of communists over the years. There's been many, and there's been various different anarchists call themselves communists. Various different religious utopians have called themselves communists. But to be a Marxist-Leninist is to be a communist. So all Marxist-Leninists are communists, but not all communists are Marxist-Leninists. I think is the most appropriate way to answer that question. But a Marxist-Leninist is what a communist should be and needs to be able to analyze situations properly. I mean, I would argue that there is a potential justification for using the term Marxist-Leninist Maoist simply because of the outstanding contributions that Mao Zedong made. But the term Maoism in the West is a somewhat polluted term due to the various idiotic groups that have tied themselves to it. So Marxist-Leninist is probably the best shorthand. And as for some socialists coming across as liberals, well, to answer Yepex's question, well, that's because they are. They are. There's no two ways about that. Most of the people who call themselves socialists, let's just take the man of the moment, Saint Jeremy of Islington, and his friends. These people are liberals. They're left liberals, but they're liberals nonetheless. Say, oh, we've got a lot of people watching from the United States tonight. Take Saint Bernard of Vermont. Again, a liberal, a left liberal who believes in a slightly extended public sector, who believes in regulation of certain elements of private industry, and that's about it. Extension of the welfare state. So that essentially is a liberal position. It's a left liberal position. It's in the case of Sanders, it's the case that he's basically a New Deal Democrat, and in the case of Corbyn, it's that he's a mid 20th century Labour Party guy, which I would argue is something which is essentially just a form of it is left liberalism. It is the form of left politics that was embraced for a while by the left end of the bourgeoisie. And this is all that Corbyn represents now. It's all that Sanders represents. A minority, a very small minority position within the bourgeoisie itself, with a certain degree of roots within the Labour aristocracy. And so most of the groups that call themselves socialist, in effect, are just that. They're welfare state liberals. Some would call them social liberals. Some of them call themselves revolutionaries. Some of them call themselves even communists. But most of their politics basically revolve around trying to reestablish welfare capitalism. Right. Just going through some of the comments here. Hello to Nemo Yederman. Hello to Sputnik 56. Hello to Comrade Paul McCord. Good evening to you. Hello to Jonas Levinson. Caustic Grip asks, given that Lenin and Castro were both legally trained, what do you think is the role of law in the history of revolutions? H. Berman argued that law forms the revolutionary consciousness. I would also say that Keir Starmer is a lawyer. So plenty of the Nazi hierarchy were lawyers. I mean, it's never just the profession, is it? I mean, you have to consider this in an all-around way. Lenin was trained in law, but he had a head start in terms of revolution because of the actions and the execution of his older brother. But again, like there was ways in which, there's plenty of lawyers and the Tsarist Empire who became reactionaries. Now, what is the role of law in the revolution? Now, that's an interesting question, given that the Lenin and Castro both completely overturned the existing state. But then that brings up the question of what role does law play in building socialism? gives us then takes us to the argument about what is the role of state compulsion versus mobilization of the masses. So that's a really interesting question, which I would like more time to think about, because I think I can't do it justice for tonight, but I will make a note of it and come back to it. So I will come back to it in the Q&A, Caustic Grip, if that's acceptable to you. I'm just writing that down now. So we will return to that in the Q&A later this week. So hello to President Jesus and Dmitry Shanish, and to what else we got here? Various viewers on Kick, some of whom might be bots. Sid Hatfield says the Bolsheviks had to work during that time to show the Russian workers all the shortcomings of the provisional government. Yeah, the shortcomings of the provisional government became obvious, but the Bolsheviks had to work to demonstrate to the working class exactly why the provisional government was acting in the way that it did, exactly why it was that they were so crap, exactly why it was that they were unable to end the war, why they were unable to do land redistribution, why the bourgeoisie remained in charge, why large numbers of workers and peasants continue to die on the front line. Now, the provisional government could fail in all of its stated objectives, which it was, but you needed the Bolsheviks needed to be doing was to be giving the correct interpretation of those events and the correct analysis of it to the working class. And because they were able to do that, they were able to win the working class over to their side. And this is what a well-drilled and well-organized revolutionary party can do when it is confronted with a situation which it has the opportunity for large growth in. If you have a solid base of working class cadres, when the class becomes more radical, when the opportunity opens up, you can grow really quickly in a relatively short period of time in terms of influence within the masses. But you have to have that solid foundation. You can't go from 0 to 100. You have to have a very, very strong party organization and decent roots within the class to be able to grow when the situation favors it, because you have to be able to give the right explanation at the right time. And when the workers are prepared to hear it, then you can, if your organization is solid, you can grow very quickly. And that's what happened to them. They got all of this right. And as a consequence of it, they were able to grow very quickly, as Sid says. Hello to T.G. Wilson. Right. Sid says, such beliefs are what prevented the Spartacist uprising from achieving power in 1919. The German proletariat was armed ready to seize power, but the leadership stood down. Yeah, I would say that and also like Luxembourg herself, for all of that she has to be saluted for the achievements of her life and the fact that she bravely faced death at the hands of the proto-fascist Freikorps, who were ordered to do it by the Gustav Nosk and Friedrich Ebert, former party comrades. The Spartacists didn't have the necessary sway with the masses to be able to carry off that revolution. So unfortunately, by 1919, whereas a minority of the German proletariat was listening to the revolutionaries who would go on to form the basis of the KPD, German Communist Party, later on, the bulk of them was still listening to the Social Democrats. Now, remember, in 1919, the Social Democrats are in power on their own. They're not actually at that stage in formal coalition with any bourgeois forces. The bourgeoisie in Germany is absolutely on the back foot, and even its reactionary parties, like the early Nazis, have to put the term worker and the term socialist in their titles. Otherwise, they don't get a hearing. So in 1919, you have incredibly powerful Soviets of workers and soldiers and sailors all the way throughout Germany. But unlike in Russia 2 years earlier, you don't have like a Bolshevik type party holding the majority, at least in the working class, major working class centers. You still have the bulk of the working class population is still listening to the Social Democrats, and the Social Democrats are telling them that the revolution's gone far enough. That we already hold power. See, unlike in the Russian provisional government, where you had all manner of bourgeois forces, you have the apparent Socialist Party already in power in 1919. So that creates all kinds of confusion amongst the ranks of the German working class, because its traditional party already holds power. And the leaders of that party are saying, we've gone far enough. We can edge our way towards socialism. Now is the time for peace, etc. So you can see why it caused a lot of confusion, and why it took a while for the advanced workers to fully unify behind the KPD. And unfortunately, the split away from the Social Democrats by 1919 was not big enough. It didn't have enough of a grip upon the masses to be able to pull off that revolution. And again, the fact that there were still very powerful Soviets in place in Germany in 1919, apparently holding a good deal of power, again, it caused confusion in the situation. So this is something which needs to be properly understood. So, and you can understand the confusion of the working class, given that the Socialist Party is in power. It is telling the working class that the new Weimar Constitution will include the Soviets as permanent institutions, even though that didn't happen, and that the achievements of the revolution will be sacrosanct in the new the new democratic worker-led republic, etc., etc. You can see, if you look back on it, you can see all of the confusion and all of the division that the Social Democrats managed to sow amongst the working class by repeatedly lying about what their own program was and what they were going to do. So, salute to Rosa Luxemburg, but this is what happens when you try and do an insurrection, when you haven't clearly exposed the role of the Social Democrats as agents of the bourgeois before the eyes of the great majority of workers, and you haven't even really done that with the most advanced sections of the workers as yet, and that the vanguard is too small and can't mobilize the rest of the working class behind it yet. And that all of those problems meant that ultimately the Spartacist uprising, though it was a very heroic endeavor, was defeated with relative ease. Mystery Man says the exact opposite has happened. Almost all of our sock dem reforms have been taken away. Yeah. When the threat disappears, so do the peaceful ways to socialism. Cooper Ward says Chomsky seriously called Lenin a right-wing deviation when Lenin spent the majority of time defending Marx from opportunists and usurpers. Well, I would say that Noam Chomsky is a very useful man for the American ruling class, because he says a lot of things that are accurate and very critical about the American ruling class and American imperialism, but he will never, ever, ever point people towards a revolutionary politics. Chomsky's politics are always vote Democrat, but call yourself an anarchist, which basically goes for the entirety of the American left, to be honest. Sputnik 56 I say post 56 CPSU wasn't exactly pro-peaceful development. Khrushchev, Brezhnev, etc. did more for anti-imperialism than even Mao did. Countless left nationalist uprisings was due to them. I wouldn't say it was due to them. I would say it was inspired by the Soviet Union, certainly. Now, post 56, yes, the Soviet Union plays an important role in continuing to aid the Vietnamese. That's true. But it was principally the Vietnamese that liberated themselves, with support from the Soviets, it must be said, and support from the Chinese too. I'd also say that the peaceful development side of it related to principally the imperialist nations. But also, I would say that the Soviet support for left nationalist movements and regimes, or things that they said were left nationalist movements and regimes, often left the communists in those countries high and dry, basically. I can go more into that in a future episode. But also I would say that the most damaging thing they did was to put out continually the idea that the European nations, particularly the European nations with significant communist parties in them, so France, Italy, and also Britain, even though the Communist Party here was much smaller, that there could be peaceful coexistence with the imperialist powers. That was a consistent line that was put forward by the Soviet leadership after 1956. Yes, Khrushchev tended to zig and zag back and forth on it, but the consistent trend of the Soviet leadership after 1956 was towards peaceful coexistence inside Europe, and the trend within the communist parties was towards that very end as well. And so I would say that that's a thing to be, that's what I'm referring to. Yes, the Soviet Union continued to assist certain anti-colonial left nationalist regimes for a long time afterwards, but the revisionist line when it came to the imperialist countries was absolutely fatal, and also the revisionist line inside the Soviet Union was absolutely fatal, because what it did was it disarmed and disempowered and eroded the consciousness of the Soviet working class, all of which led to ultimately the fatal disaster that was Gorbachevism 30 years later. Right. Yes, the Second International still exists, but the Labour Party is the leading force in it, which tells you an awful lot about what that is. Sid says, it seems that most of the bourgeois investment in Tsarist Russia came from Western Europe and America, which is probably why they, more so than anyone, facilitated the bloody counter-revolution. Yeah. I mean, the British didn't deploy, and the French and others didn't deploy all those troops and bankroll those white armies just for a laugh, just because they feared communism, even though that was a big part of why they did it. This was serious money that was on the table here. This was decades of investment inside the Tsarist Empire. This is future profits that were on the table. I mean, the usage of Russia for its cheap labor and for its plentiful peasant soldiers was a big prize for the US, British, and French ruling classes, which is why they were all so invested in the counter-revolution. It wasn't just for reasons of countering communism, even though that was part of it. It was about protecting investments, which they were going to lose. Mushkin says, often wondered about the Ukrainian uncle in Chomsky's personal mythology. Yeah, who was he? Was he some guy who was actually a Banderite? Right. What do you think of Chomsky's view that the April Thesis is a libertarian document? I don't think Chomsky understands Lenin's thought at all. I wonder how much of it he's read. I mean, we should bear in mind that Chomsky is an anti-communist and always has been. But I haven't seen where the writing or the interview where he refers to it as that. I wouldn't call it a libertarian document. I would call it a communist document. So that is the way in which I would describe it, and it's consistent with the line of development of Lenin's thought since at least 1905. And it's actually consistent with, as Lenin demonstrated in State and Revolution, with the revolutionary aspects of Marxism, which is all of Marxism. So it's not an out of the blue thing. It's not Lenin suddenly changing Marxism. It's Lenin constantly going back and redeveloping the line of the party in line with the developing consciousness of the working class, but also consistently uncovering and rediscovering the revolutionary the revolutionary nature of the work of Marx and Engels. Lista Costadino says it is interesting that the local population in Volgograd, former Stalingrad, have been keeping the legacy of Stalin for a very long time. Yeah, and eventually it will probably be renamed Stalingrad again, because that is the seemingly the way things are going inside Russia itself. Dmitry Shani says SR, Social Revolutionary, is supposed to be the party for the peasants. That is probably why they united with the Bolsheviks, because they could not reject revolutionary land distribution demands. The left SRs did. The right-wing SRs decisively sided with the white armies. Okay. Going through some more comments here. I've got limited time tonight, so I'm just going to focus on the immediately important questions, and we can stick the rest of these and put them in a Q&A for later in the week. So I'm just trawling through here, trying to find something. Yepex, a while ago in passing, Yepex asks, I heard something about Lenin supporting Zionism. I've seen no evidence for this. What is the story behind his claim? There's no evidence of it, because the opposite is true. Like the Zionism and Bundism were consistently opposed by Lenin and the other Bolshevik leaders. Jewish separatism was specifically argued against by Stalin in his work on nationhood, and by Lenin in his work on on the right of nations to self-determination. The Stalin and the national question specifically makes the point that the Jews are not a people, a unified people. They're not a nation. They are a religious group that is part of several different nations and several different peoples. So there's no evidence that Lenin supported Zionism. In fact, the opposite is true. Lenin consistently opposed that kind of religious separatism, and Stalin, who was designated to write the book on the national question, specifically denounced the idea of the Jews as a nation. So it's nonsense. People just, reactionaries in particular, just say all kinds of shit about Lenin and about Stalin. You get this with Russian reactionaries as much as Western ones, about Lenin and Stalin, and say, oh, they supported this, this, and this. And there's no evidence of it, because the crowd of morons that they speak to never asks for any. You can say that Lenin was, a British agent, and you can get away with it, because the meme-addled brains of like Russian nationalists never asks any questions. Right. Dmitry Shani says, Harpal Braz's book about perestroika and the fall of revisionism is really good. There is Russian translation for fellow Russians, just in case. Yes, very much worth the read. Yepex asks, do you have a video clip describing how capitalism and welfare capitalism and how socialists, whether they know it or not, are advocating for more capitalism and not the abolition of it? Don't have one myself, but I could certainly do one. Be relatively easy to do. Right. Okay. So I will have to draw things to a close for this evening. I'll be going for just over an hour. So this program will return next week, probably for longer. I have to knock things on the head for tonight, because I have to prepare for the Decline and Fall show that will be on tomorrow. And so be sure to join me again for that. The relevant clips of this will be out later tomorrow, so keep an eye out for those. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again with Decline and Fall tomorrow. But until then, thank you for tuning in. And now I throw you back over to our video outro.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страной страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы.
Продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
С неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.